I met Marissa, I guess 3 or 4 years ago, when my wife and I had decided we were going to be relocating to Mid-Coast Maine in our retirement. Not being the retiring sort, I was looking for local, like-minded sorts. I'm a lapsed marine biologist myself, long lapsed, and looking to connect to some local nonprofits that were doing work to support our coastal environment. And so I got connected with Marissa by mutual friends, excuse me. Marissa comes from a family of watermen in Phippsburg, and she's currently director of fisheries at the Manomet Foundation in Brunswick at the Fort Andros Mill. She mentors and teaches at UNE, University of Maine, as well as being an advisor to the Basin Oyster Project and greencrab.org. She's an avid scuba diver and instructor, and she has studied the biology of the European green crab, among many other accomplishments. Marissa received her PhD in ecology, evolution, and marine biology from Northeastern University not too long ago, 2017. It's a youngster compared to me, that's for sure. And a master's in marine biology from the University of Maine in 2011. She has studied marine ecology and fisheries in the Gulf of Maine for over a decade. Most of her life has revolved around working as a commercial fisherperson, fisherwoman, fisherman, whatever terminology is appropriate. I know she told me fisherman was the way she referred to her family in Phippsburg. Most of her life. So anyway, and she's focused on strengthening and diversifying fishing opportunities in the Gulf of Maine, and trying to preserve fishing cultures and traditions while also promoting a healthy and resilient marine ecosystem. Marissa, sorry for the long introduction, but you deserve it. And hopefully people know a little bit about who they're going to be hearing from now. Please take over.
Thank you so much, Jed. That was a great introduction. Yeah, I'm happy to be here tonight and have the chance to talk to a new audience of folks about some of the work that we're doing on green crabs. For those of you who aren't familiar with Manomet, so we're a nonprofit organization. We're actually based out of Plymouth, Massachusetts. That's where our headquarters is. We do work throughout the entire Western Hemisphere, a lot of work in shorebird conservation and forestry and agriculture. But our fisheries work is really focused on the Gulf of Maine, and our fisheries office is located right in Brunswick in the Fort Andros building. So very local to where all of you folks are probably located. So I'm just going to I'll share my screen, and then I'm going to turn my video off just because sometimes I struggle with internet issues. So just to make sure I'm not overloading my internet here. Let's see, stop video. Okay. And can everyone see that screen? Jed, are you able to see the screen?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Perfect. Mm-hmm. All right. So yeah, so we do a lot of work in fisheries in the Gulf of Maine, really focused on, again, as Jed said, diversifying fishing opportunities while also really trying to, strengthen our coastal ecosystems and coastal communities. So this work fits into sort of that broader portfolio of work that we're doing. And I really want to start, I'm of course going to focus on green crabs tonight, but I really want to start more broadly and sort of pose the question why. So why are we doing this work with green crabs? Why do we care about green crabs? How does it fit into the bigger picture? And to do that, I like to start with this sort of snapshot, or a lot of snapshots, of what the Gulf of Maine and what fisheries in the Gulf of Maine used to look like 50, 60, 100 years ago. We had really abundant resources, diverse and productive fisheries, many species supporting many different fisheries, essentially, and a system that really supported effort being spread among these different fisheries instead of focused just entirely on one species or a few species. And so what I mean by that is we had a system of small scale seasonal fisheries. So you could fish for cod and halibut in the spring, and lobster and tuna and clams in the summer, shrimp and scallops in the fall and winter, etc., instead of just fishing for the same species year round. And I also like to use this slide as an introduction because most of these photos are actually photos of my family over multiple generations, and the different fisheries that my family's participated in throughout the years. My grandfather actually started fishing in the 1940s, and he was fishing for at least a dozen different species back then. But if we sort of fast forward and look at fisheries today, and sort of look at what that diversity looks like now, we see a very different picture. So first, I'll just start with Massachusetts. And I just broke this into the two different Maine states in the Gulf of Maine, which is Massachusetts and Maine. And so this is just a snapshot of what diversity looks like now. So simply looking at a pie chart of the different species and their value in landings. And so we can see that 75% of the value of commercial species in Massachusetts comes from just two species, sea scallops and American lobster. If we look at Maine, it's actually an even sort of more bleak situation, where we actually see that 79% of the value of all commercial fisheries comes from just one species, the lobster. So this is a pretty precarious situation to be in, right? So if you've ever heard the phrase, all of your eggs are in one basket, that's basically what's happening here. So if anything were to happen to, either of these species, and really in particular to the American lobster, we would really see an entire collapse of this fisheries system. And so again, just sort of bringing it back to my own experiences in the commercial fishing industry. Like I said, my grandfather, when he started fishing in the 40s and 50s, fished for over a dozen different species. My father still fishes today, and he fishes for just lobster. My partner, Chris, also fishes, and he fishes for just lobster, because that's essentially, the only real resource that is left for fishers in the Gulf of Maine. So if that's not precarious enough, we also find ourselves in a period of immense environmental change. The Gulf of Maine is warming faster than 99% of the world's oceans. So this figure is actually showing warming trends in the Gulf of Maine from the 1980s to just about the 2015 time period. And that black dotted or dashed line is showing the gradual increase in temperature over that time period. But the red line is actually showing the rate of warming in just the past decade. So you can see how much steeper that line is, indicating a very rapid and unprecedented acceleration of warming in the Gulf of Maine. And this warming is really altering the very structure and function of the ecosystem. And one of the ways that this can really readily be seen and felt in the fisheries system is through the redistribution and abundance of species. So just a couple of examples here. We're seeing northern shrimp, which is a cold water loving species, has all but disappeared from the Gulf of Maine. This used to be a very important winter fishery. We're seeing Atlantic cod, which were once common in shallow coastal waters, moving deeper where water is colder. We're seeing things at the very base of the food chain being impacted. So this is a plankton species called a copepod. Many species rely on this tiny organism for food, but copepods are moving north because they are also a cold water loving species. And two species in particular that rely on this for food would be lobsters and right whales. So two pretty major heavy hitting species in terms of both ecological and economic importance. And then we're also seeing things like invasive species thriving, and one in particular being the green crab. Green crabs really are enjoying this warming water and seem to be doing better and better every year and becoming more and more abundant. And then we're also seeing some new players, some new species that we didn't used to have in the Gulf of Maine because it was too cold. These are sort of more southern and mid-Atlantic species. but they're now moving north and they're really thriving in this warm water. So things like squid and scup, black sea bass, and hardshell clams. So what we're really seeing here is just these rippling effects throughout the entire ecosystem. So to go back to that question I posed of why, create fisheries and markets for green crabs, why do we care? It's really about, first and foremost, diversification. So can we find new fisheries resources for fishers to be able to diversify? Mitigation. So are there ways that we can try to combat the harmful impacts of invasive species through creating fisheries and markets? And then adaptation. So if warming water is giving us excess green crabs, then we should be able to adapt to that and to take advantage of it. So I just want to pause in talking about green crabs in the Gulf of Maine and just step back for a minute and do just a little bit of invasive species 101 and just a bit of background here. So invasive species are non-native species that have been introduced to an area and almost always cause ecological damage and most often also cause economic damage. Some common traits are that they can adapt and reproduce really quickly in their new range. They often can outcompete native species, and usually they have very few or no predators in these newly expanded areas. Just a little information on sort of potential approaches to eradicating an invasive species. There's a list I put up here, and it ranges, this is just, a sort of general list of ways that people have tried in the past to eradicate invasive species, ranging from viruses and parasites being introduced that target the invasive species. If we're talking about insects and plants, often pesticides or herbicides are used. Introducing predators, which is a pretty risky thing to do and can have negative repercussions, and then targeted removal. And I just simply put this up here because in the case of green crabs, targeted removal has really been the only viable option because all of these other strategies just pose too much of a risk to native species. Right, so eradicating the invader shouldn't come at the risk of harming native species. So if we dive a little bit deeper now, specifically into the green crab invasion, they are, of course, the European green crab. So they originated from Northern Europe, which is shown as the native range in blue on this map. They invaded the United States in 1817. They were brought from Europe in ship ballast water, and they have since invaded every continent except Antarctica. So the different reds and green shades on this map, basically all of the other areas except in that native blue range are the places that green crabs have invaded. They are a global invader and one of the most successful invasive species in the entire world. They, of course, have devastating ecological impacts here in New England. They're a voracious predator of bivalve shellfish, things like soft-shell clams, which is pictured here. This is a crab that's just cracking into a soft-shell clam to have a nice dinner. They also eat things like oysters and mussels and really any sort of bivalve shellfish. They also destroy eelgrass and salt marsh habitat, which are two critically important coastal habitats. And so this photo on the bottom, which does not have great resolution, but essentially you can kind of see the salt marsh eroding. And there's a lot of things that can cause the salt marsh to erode like this, but one of the things is that the green crabs will burrow into the bank and they'll actually sort of destabilize the bank from within. And similar to the eelgrass habitat, they'll burrow down into the eelgrass and they'll sort of uproot it and destabilize the eelgrass bed. So, despite, and then one last, they also compete with native species. So things like Jonah crabs and small lobsters, they can compete for resources like food and shelter. And despite, all of these really negative, harmful impacts, and despite the fact that they have been in this country for over 200 years now, we really still haven't found a successful mitigation strategy. Targeted removal has been tried in many locations through trapping programs. In some instances, trapping programs have removed hundreds of thousands of green crabs, and there has been almost no indication that it's had any impact. So what we do know is that eradication is likely impossible. And that is what led myself and several of my colleagues to this "if you can't beat them, eat them" strategy a few years ago. And simply put, if they're here and they're here to stay and we can't eradicate them, then we should figure out how to benefit from them. And so is there a way that we can turn this into an opportunity? And to that point, this picture here is actually a plate of deep fried soft shell green crabs. And the photo is taken in Venice, Italy. So it turns out that there is a centuries-old fishery in Venice for a very similar, almost identical species of green crab. It's the Mediterranean green crab. And it's incredibly lucrative. So fishers are actually getting upwards of $55 a pound for these soft shell green crabs in the height of the season. So these are a few images of the fishery. So the Venetian fishers they set nets, spike nets in the Venetian lagoon to catch the crabs, and then they bring them to shore and sort through them to sort of pull out the crabs that they're going to keep for this fishery. So with this sort of knowledge in hand, knowing that there were really successful fisheries that operated elsewhere in the world for an almost identical species, we set out to adapt this fishery here in New England. And much of this work was made possible by a community volunteer named Jonathan Taggart, who happened to be working in Venice at the time, but lived in Georgetown, Maine. And he was able to make connections with these fishers, and we were able to actually, not only learn from these Venetian crab fishers, but actually host one of them here in Maine, and then also travel to Venice to work directly with them and get hands-on experience in this fishery and sort of learning directly from the fishers. So that photo on the left there is the trip that we took to Venice, and that's Paolo and Domenico showing one of the US fishers who went over, Chris Jameson, what they're looking for in their catch. And then the photo on the right is Paolo working with Chris and myself in Maine. This was back, I think, 2017, I think. So several years ago now, but really, really incredibly valuable to have this exchange of information and ideas and techniques, and really made it possible for us to sort of accelerate being able to adapt this fishery here. Now, the entire fishery hinges upon recognizing what we call pre-molt crabs. So these are crabs that are just about to shed their shell and become soft. That's also known as molting. And for those of you who maybe aren't familiar with this process, molting is how crustaceans grow. So they shed their old hard shell and have a new soft shell underneath that they grow into, and that allows them to grow bigger. And so that's also why we have hard shell and soft shell lobsters in the lobster fishery. And so here what we're seeing is that there is a subtle sign along the edges of the platelets on the crab. So essentially it looks like a halo along each edge. And so this is an image here showing sort of the different, little areas along each platelet that we're looking at. And again, sort of showing that shadow and halo that kind of forms along each edge. And essentially the reason that's happening is because the new shell has started to grow underneath the old shell, and the two shells begin to separate leading up to the molt. And that is basically what's causing this sign that's indicating this crab's about to molt. So once the crab molts and is soft, that's when it's worth the most money. So it's very essential to be able to identify these pre-molts. And I always like to point out here that despite green crabs having invaded the US over 200 years ago, and over 100 years of scientists researching these crabs, no one knew about this until just a few years ago when these Venetian fishers clued us into it. So without these Venetian fishers helping us to develop this fishery, we would be, in the dark still. So After working with the Venetian fishers, we gathered together a team of researchers, students, and community volunteers right here in Mid-Coast Maine to monitor crab populations and figure out when and where we could find these pre-molts, and then actually practice producing the soft shell crabs. So this was work that happened from 2018 to 2020. And a lot of it happened in the New Meadows, the Kennebec, and the Damariscotta River estuaries. So those were the areas where we were trapping the crabs and sorting and holding the crabs. So essentially, you know, we go out, we trap these crabs, we identify the pre-molts, we pull out all of those pre-molt crabs, and then we put them in individual holding cells, which we like to call crab condos. And essentially the reason behind this is that these crabs are cannibals. And so if you hold them all together, as soon as they start molting, they're super vulnerable when they're in that soft phase, the other crabs will eat them. So, and then you lose all of your valuable product. So we had to figure out a way to effectively and efficiently store these crabs individually. So we developed these little crab condo cages, and then those fit right inside a lobster crate, which, you know, readily available and accessible to most fishers. They already have these crates. And then those crates can be, you know, just tied onto a dock or a mooring. And that's sort of the way that you can, you know, essentially store these crabs as you're waiting for them to molt. And this is somewhat similar to how the Venetian fishery works as well. From 2017 to 2019, we got pretty good at actually identifying these pre-molts. So this is when a crab is about to, or this is when a crab has begun molting. And so that sort of pale faded shell is the old shell that the crab is molting out of. And the new shell underneath is really bright and vibrant. And then this is sort of after the crab has completed the process. So this smaller shell on the top of this photo is just the old empty shell that the crab has left behind. And then the larger crab on the bottom is the crab now grown into its new shell. So you can see they actually increase in size quite a bit in this molting process. So we got pretty good at identifying these pre-molt crabs, holding them in cages, and then waiting for them to go through this molt process, which takes about 2 weeks usually. And so we had an 82% success rate of actually, you know, identifying the pre-molts and then having a soft shell product produced. And we felt pretty good about that because, you know, the Venetians have been at it for centuries and they still aren't completely perfect. You know, they probably have like a 95% success rate, but we felt pretty good about getting up to an 82% success rate in just a couple of years. And even better, we actually had some volunteer fishers working with us in 2019. They're pictured here. And they were actually able to experiment with producing soft shells on a very small scale, just as sort of like a side business. And they were able to produce about 100 crabs a week and then sold those crabs for $3 a piece to local restaurants. And so that actually $3 for a green crab actually translates to about $25 to $30 a pound. So very, very lucrative. And then these restaurants put them on the menu for $9 a crab and sold out immediately every time. And this is what the final product looked like on your plate. So this is very similar to soft shell blue crab, if you're familiar with that product. You commonly see that in the southern US. In fact, many of the chefs we worked with were substituting these green crabs for the blue crab that they would already have on their menus. And so this was our first indication that this was a very lucrative potential market. There was definitely demand, and the demand way exceeded the supply. So there's a lot of room to grow in this industry. Now, one of the biggest hurdles that we faced is that it's a fairly low volume fishery. So even in the peak molting season, which tends to be the spring and early summer, only about 25% of the catch is going to be this pre-molt crab that eventually will be the soft shell product. So that leaves the question of what to do with the rest of your catch. But luckily there's a lot of great work going into value added products. So things like compost. This is actually This is from Jonathan Taggart, one of our community partners. He took a bunch of green crabs home and he dug out a row that he put green crabs in his garden and then planted corn in it. And he did a row with crabs and a row without crabs side by side. And if you see the next image, the sort of yellow sickly corn was the corn that didn't have green crabs planted beneath it. And the nice, vibrant, green, taller corn is the row that had the green crabs. So, just a very, sort of first attempt at looking at what this product could look like for compost. But there's also folks at the University of Maine and a few other locations that are really interested in developing fertilizers and composts from this crab. There's also a lot of work going into figuring out how to create bait products. There are bait fisheries that exist that utilize green crabs, most commonly the whelk fishery and the tautog hook and line fishery in southern New England, but there are folks who are actually trying to develop bait products out of green crabs that could be used for the lobster fishery up here in Maine. A bait shortage has been an issue for the lobster fishery for the last few years, so this would be a great opportunity. There's also folks who are looking at developing dog food. So this is actually a product that you can buy. It's invasive green crab and egg recipe dog food. And I think this goes for something crazy like $20 or $30 for a 5-pound bag. So again, some really potential lucrative industries and value-added products that can be made here. And then also, I just want to also point out that there, beyond just sort of the bait and compost and those sorts of things, there's a whole bunch of other culinary value-added products that are also in development. Things like crab stock and fermented crab sauce and green crab caviar that utilizes the crab eggs or the roe. And so, this is just a sort of snapshot collage of some of those different products that people have worked on. And there is in fact a green crab cookbook that has a ton of recipes and really creative ways of utilizing green crabs. But I would just say even more broadly that I really think, we as a society and as consumers, we need to broaden our horizons when we think about what seafood is, because there's a lot of really delicious and sustainable seafood out there, like green crabs, that we aren't eating and we could be. So with that, I just want to bring us full circle. Again, remembering what fisheries in the Gulf of Maine used to look like, really diverse and abundant species supporting numerous local fisheries. And I'd like to end by saying that I think we can get there again and we can have diverse fisheries, but I think the species will look different. Maybe some will be the same, but most of them will be new. Things like green crabs and squid and black sea bass and scup and aquaculture grown products as well, like seaweed and oysters. And I think, part of this transformation is really going to rely on consumers. So I always like to tell people that you can help support diverse fisheries by eating a diversity of seafood, trying new types of seafood, and supporting local fishers and fish markets. And with that, I would be happy to take any questions that folks have.
So Marissa, thank you so much. There was a question about and I'd encourage folks to post questions on the chat board. There was a question about what do folks in Venice do with the culls. I think you you addressed the fact that there are a lot of potential uses for that 75% of non-soft shell crabs. But I wonder if you could answer that question, but also comment a little bit on why you initially, anyway, sounded like you were fixated on the soft shell crabs only. And as I understood from you, I think there's a tremendous difficulty in utilizing the little meat that's available in the hard shell crab or the non-molted crab. It's not an automatic, there's no automated picking. Coming from the Chesapeake Bay region, where I was spoiled with blue crabs. There's a lot of easy picking there. And I love, I should just add that one of those dishes you showed looked like it was one that I had at the Daniel a few years ago that was with a soft shell European green crab. Absolutely delicious. But yeah, if you could talk about the other 75% a little bit and why it's so tough. And I guess you didn't bring any videos of the aggressive nature of the crabs when they raid lobster pots, but a few words to emphasize just how brutal those little suckers are might be interesting to some people.
Yeah. So I'll try and go in order of the questions.
Sorry, I'll try to repeat them if you forget.
Okay, yeah. So great question about the difference with the 75% between our fishery and the Venetian fishery. The biggest difference is that in Venice, it's a native species. And so it's actually part of their sort of sustainable management plan that anything that they're not keeping just goes back into the lagoon. So they just throw it all back. And in Venice, there's a lot of, sort of, because it's a native species, they have natural predators. There's sort of just, a more sort of equilibrium to the population. They're not sort of like exploded and overrun like they are here. Here, because it's an invasive species, you actually can't put it back. So when you go out and catch 100 pounds, if you only have 25 pounds that are going to your soft shell fishery, you have to figure out what to do with the rest of it because you can't put it back because it's an invader. So that's sort of the, the impetus behind, I think that there could be easily standalone soft shell green crab fisheries, but we just do need to figure out that other part of, making use of the 75% because as a soft shell green crab fisher, you have to figure out, something else to do with them. And so I think there's a lot of opportunity in value add. My cat's gonna come on the screen now, of course. I think there's a lot of opportunity with the value added products. Like you said, Jed, this crab is very small bodied compared to sort of, the normal crabs that we think about in the US. And so it's not easy to pick the meat out. And there is no real sort of, we've tried every different high pressure processing, every different, type of technology that would allow you to extract the meat. And there's just not really an effective way of doing that. So we need to think about other potential products that we could develop outside of a picked meat market, which is sort of, the easiest low hanging fruit when you think about crabs. I think there's a lot of potential in these value added products. I know you said something about how aggressive they are, so that's the next one I'll tackle, but then remind me getting. They're incredibly aggressive. I mean, that's one of the reasons why they're such a really successful invader, because they can just outcompete almost anything. We actually did some sort of like little tank experiments we've done it with elementary school kids, middle school kids, and high school kids at this point. And so that the students will write down the observations of the green crabs in their tanks. And often there will be like other species in the tank with the green crabs. And I have a video actually of feeding time when they dropped in food into the tank. And the green crab in the tank just sort of like holds everything away and just eats all of the food. Like it literally held down a hermit crab, pinned it down to the ground so it couldn't move and couldn't come at the food and eat any of it, and just, gorged itself on all of the food. There was nothing left for anything else in the tank. So that's the type of competitor and predator that they are. And it's just really challenging for our native species to be able to put up a fight against that.
Great. Well, thank you. Well, while we've been talking with this first question from me, a number of people have started to populate the chats. So I'll omit names for the sake of time, but there are a few questions, for example, that deal not specifically with the green crab, but I think with some other fisheries that you've highlighted as being on the downslope or not being very prolific in this state. So two of those questions from a physician and a veterinarian respectively. Is there any hope of restoring the mussel fishery in Maine? I assume that means. And the second one is, could the soft shell industry be expanded to a cottage industry for fishermen as an added income source? And I guess that's doesn't mean soft shell clams. It means, I presume, soft shell molted green crabs. But
Yeah.
yeah, at first when I saw it, I thought it meant they were talking about soft shell clams or steamers. But anyway.
Yeah, so for the first one, the mussel fishery, so the green crab invasion is part of the reason why the wild mussel fishery has been in decline and it's just really not doing well. I think, the way forward that I see the most success in that fishery with that particular species is likely through aquaculture. And so we are seeing more and more mussel aquaculture. And, just by the nature of how they do it, those mussels that are grown off of aquaculture rafts are grown on long lines, but the green crabs can't get to them because they're in deep water. And so it protects them from green crab predation. Whereas the wild mussel fishery operates along the shoreline in shallow or even intertidal water, and there's just no way to protect those mussels from green crab predation. So, while it's unfortunate, I do think there is at least an opportunity to move into sort of that more mussel aquaculture way of production for that species. As to the question of the cottage industry, absolutely. And that's sort of what we had been thinking, particularly, so two of the fishers who participated in the project, one was a full-time lobsterman, one was a full-time clam digger. And for both of them, we sort of did like a case study of what this could look like. And so for the lobster fisher, it was utilizing the same gear that he already used, traps and crates and things like that. So that was a really easy, way to enter into the green crab fishery. And, it was done sort of adjacent to lobstering. So he would go out, he'd do his lobstering, and at the end of the day, he'd come in and he'd check his crabs in his crate. And if he had any soft crabs, he'd pull them out and harvest them and bring them in along with his lobster catch. So it worked out really well. And again, it was just sort of that extra little, like in that slide, he was doing 100 crabs a week, getting $3 a crab. That was an extra $300 in his pocket a week. And similar with the clam digger, it's a little bit different because the gear is different from, the sort of traditional gear you use for digging clams, but it's also an environment where you're coming into contact with green crabs constantly. And it's a huge threat to your industry because they eat so many clams. And so, again, like finding those ways that we can develop fisheries that fit into the types of fishing that are already happening so that, it is just adding sort of another supplemental fishery to your portfolio. And again, giving you a little bit more of that resilience because you're not 100% dependent on just one fishery. So yes, I absolutely think that is the way that I see this really taking off, as sort of an add-on to what you're already doing.
So there was a governmental incentive of some sort down in Barnstable or someplace in Massachusetts where they were offering $1 a crab, or I don't know what the number was, sort of a price on the heads of green crabs. That didn't work, did it?
Yeah, no. So there was a bounty program in Massachusetts, and they paid, I can't remember what it was. I think it was like 40 or 50 cents a pound for any green crabs landed. And I mean, it's not hard to get. I mean, you can go out and get hundreds and hundreds of pounds in a day. So it actually, pays off if you go out and do that targeted trapping and land, 1,000 pounds of green crabs for a day. That's the instance where over the course of that program's run for, I don't know, 5, 6, maybe 7 years now. And over the course of that time period, they haven't noticed a reduction in green crabs, despite having taken that many out of the ecosystem. So, it's not to say that it's completely, I mean, there's hundreds of thousands less green crabs than there would have been without that program. I think the issue is that that's not a long-term solution, because that money is like, state earmarked money, and that can change at any moment, whether or not they'd have funding to run that program. And without the funding, you're not going to incentivize anyone to go out and catch green crabs. And, I think for the most part, they were just, piling up crates in a field and leaving them there, not really necessarily finding a use for them. And so I think sort of, the more natural solution that creates a sustained incentive to go out and do this is to have a market that, you can readily put the product into.
Right. Thank you. Okay, we've got another series of questions. Somebody's asked, does the European green crab not molt annually, and does it molt at a particular time of the year? And I know I visited with you with your student who was looking at ability to forecast molt. And so, yeah, what have you learned about the molting habits of these little darlings?
Yeah, that's a great question. So it changes over their life cycle. When they first, they essentially start out as an egg, and when the egg hatches into a larval phase, they're in this larval phase floating around in the water column for several weeks, and then they do what we call settle onto the bottom, and they sort of metamorphose into what we know as a crab. But they're very small. They're like the size of a tick at that stage. So in that first year of life, they will molt like up to a dozen times in order to get through, that really vulnerable phase where they're so small. So they grow really rapidly. And then it starts to slow down. So, in the first or the second year of life, you might see it's more like 3 or 4 times. And then, as they progress, they eventually get to where they molt typically once a year. And then eventually they reach what we call a terminal molt, which is the signal that growing is done. And so the size range that we're targeting are, sort of the medium to large size crabs, because that's what the restaurants want. And those crabs are typically molting once a year. Occasionally they might molt twice a year, but it's different for the males and the females. So there's a seasonality. The males typically molt in the spring and early summer, and the females molt after that. So the females tend to molt in the late summer and early fall. What Jed was referring to is we did some experiments to try to see if we could force molting to happen sooner. And so we took a bunch of, typically when you find these pre-molt crabs and you look, you find the sign, you put them in a cage, it could be, 2 to 3, sometimes 4 weeks before they actually molt. So we wanted to see if we could speed that process up to sort of ramp up production. So we actually put these crabs in tanks and then manipulated the temperature of the water. So we warmed the tanks up essentially, because water temperature is linked to this growth cycle. And so we actually were able to cut the time in half that it takes for these crabs to molt by warming up the water. So we think that is a viable potential way to ramp up production. But of course, then it comes with the cost of having all of these other considerations, like you have to have tanks that you can manipulate water temperature in. And that obviously is going to cost more than just, housing crabs in crates in the ocean. So, I think there's a lot still to be worked out there. And I think there's likely, potentially 2 models, right? Like there could be a branching off where we see, one way of producing these crabs looks like, the Venetian method, where you hold these crabs in crates and wait until they molt. And a different, potential method could be utilizing more of sort of an aquaculture kind of infrastructure, where you have crabs that you're able to actually manipulate in that way.
Yeah. Thank you. Okay, we've got another question from a farmer. Well, I know she's not a farmer per se, but bring us back to land and asking about the corn photo you showed. And the question is, was the corn grown in the same year the crabs were buried? In other words, were they composted over a season? Yeah, crabs and corn planted?
Yeah, so he took the crabs, I believe, in the spring. I think we started that year we started trapping in April. So we had a lot of crabs early in the spring. He soaked the crab. So this is the other thing, it's really hard to get these crabs to die. So like you can leave them out of the water for months and they don't die. They can actually breathe air across their gills. They can absorb oxygen across their gills. So one of the many, many reasons in a long list of why they are such successful invaders. But one of the biggest challenges actually in doing this composting has been that people will take these crabs home with them and they don't die. And so it's really challenging, and they'll like be running around your yard and your garden. So what this person did actually was soak them in fresh water. And that seemed to be the key to very quickly and humanely killing the crabs, because they can't tolerate fresh water. And he soaked them, I think, like overnight, and then, dug those trenches, dumped the crabs in. Again, this was in the spring, filled it back in with soil, planted the corn, and then that photo was taken at the end of the year. So, and from what I understand, this is getting a little bit far afield from my area of expertise, but from what I understand, there's a lot of different components within the crab shell, chitin and other things like that, that are really beneficial for the soil and are actually beneficial for keeping away pests. And so it's, part of it is, I think, controlling the acidity of the soil and keeping the acidity in sort of that sweet spot. But yeah, I think there's a lot more that we can learn in that space. And I think there's a ton of opportunity, because it does seem like, from the few small scale sort of experiments like that I've seen, that they really work well.
Well, thank you. I see you've got a picture of the American eel on the composite you're showing, and I've read, I don't know this firsthand, but I've read that the glass eels, the elvers or the babies, are an extraordinarily valuable crop in Maine. When they're caught migrating upstream. How do the European green crabs like the taste of baby eels? In other words, have they disrupted that fishery at all, or are they threatening that fishery?
I have not seen any evidence of that. I don't know that anyone has necessarily asked that question, so it's not to say that they don't overlap at all. From what I know, I mean, there's folks who have done diet studies and things like that with green crabs to really get, take a close look at what they're eating. I don't know that I've ever seen evidence of American eels in the diet, but it is possible. And I will say, when we do a lot of the trapping, we tend to catch adult eels and green crabs in the same traps in the areas where we're trapping. So they are in the same habitat, or at least the adults. With the adult eels, a green crab probably wouldn't be able to have much of an impact.
Yeah. Great. Well, there's one more set of questions, 3 questions from the same person, and then maybe if you have a couple of more minutes and want to throw it open and see if anybody has a last minute question, we could do that, or else keep posting them, folks. So the 3 questions here that are on the chat box are: do you think that people could make cat food out of the crabs? Do people make other things with them? Which I think you've addressed a bit. And then, how old do green crabs get?
I'm just waiting to open up a newspaper or turn on the radio and hear that somebody has developed cat food using green crabs. It seems the most sort of no-brainer. So yeah, I would expect that would be something that could and will happen, especially now that there's been success with this dog food. Interestingly, in that scenario, there's I think that company, it's called Root Lab, but I think they're a subsidiary of Purina, or one of the really big pet food companies. And they're sourcing hundreds of thousands of pounds of green crabs a year to make these products. So I think that we'll just see that continue, and the creativity and the new types of products and for different animals and things like that. The other thing that I think is another sort of no-brainer is chicken feed. Somehow mashing these things up and mixing it into chicken feed. So yeah, I think it just takes, the sort of entrepreneur type, brain set and motivation and energy. And I think the sky's the limit, because there's so many of these things that, I think we can continue to develop products and be able to sustainably support those products in those industries. Sorry, can you jog my memory of what the other?
Yeah, the questions were about other types of animal foods, and then what other things do people make with green crabs? But before you get to that, maybe just in terms of these other animal repurposing of food, making food for other animals, nutritionally, do we know, I assume we know a bit about green crabs and how they sort of, what protein quality is and so on. And secondarily, obvious to me, but maybe I'm wrong, I would assume you don't have to get a soft shell crab to make dog or cat or chicken food. I assume you grind up the whole thing, including the shells, which is a lot of calcium. And I don't know if that maybe is a problem for some species, some animal species, but.
Yeah, again, this is a little bit far afield for my area of expertise, but the sort of things that I know from the research that I've done, I don't know how it translates to mammals, but I know that folks have tried to use green crabs for like salmon food, for aquaculture raised salmon and other fin fish. Because again, what a sustainable way to feed salmon if you can just use an invasive species. But I know that the ash content has been an issue, and that you can use green crabs, but you'd have to add other things as well. So you can't just use it as like a standalone. You'd have to, mix some proportion of some other more sort of maybe lipid rich type source of protein and fatty oils and things like that. So that's specific to feeding fish. I'm not entirely sure with cats and dogs and things like that. So it is possible that, there are potential issues there. But one of the other things, to your point about the calcium content, so the University of Maine's food lab actually has done a lot of experimenting with value-added products with green crab. And they have a deboning machine where essentially you just throw in the hard shell green crab, frozen. You just, take green crabs, throw them in a freezer, then throw them into this machine. And it basically separates the hard and the soft parts. So a lot of the shell content ends up kind of getting separated out. And then all of the soft parts end up going, into a lot of these different products. And so there is that way of potentially controlling, how much shell is actually in whatever product you have. And then that shell waste product is what potentially could be going into sort of the composts and the fertilizers and things like that.
Well, Marissa, there are no more questions on the chat box unless I've missed one. No, I think I've got them all. Is there anybody else who has a final question or comment for Marissa? Because I think we're at about the end of our hour. Very much appreciate your educating us on this pest and the work that you're doing with it.
Absolutely. I did just open the chat and I forgot to answer the how old the green crabs get question. And that typically like a 7-year-old green crab would be a very old green crab. So they have a somewhat short lifespan. And then are they easy to catch commercially? They're incredibly easy to catch. They're everywhere. You can literally walk down the shoreline and flip seaweed and rocks over and find them all over the place. And I will say that because it's an invasive species, anyone can do it. So you don't need a license, you don't need a permit. You can go down to the shoreline, collect a 5-gallon bucket full of green crabs and bring them home to experiment with in your kitchen. If you want to sell them commercially, you have to buy a license from the state of Maine that costs a whopping $10. So one of the easiest entry fisheries that we have here in the state of Maine.
Lisa has asked, are you predicting that the numbers will continue to grow, and if so, rapidly?
Yes. Yeah. The abundance seems to be very closely linked with temperature. And so we expect temperature to continue to increase, and we would expect green crabs. Mostly it's because when we used to have really cold winters, it really knocked back the population because they are from a place native, that they didn't necessarily experience such cold winters. And so our cold winters here in Maine in particular have really knocked them back in the past, even compared to places like Massachusetts and Rhode Island. But as we see winters continue to get warmer and warmer, and we see sort of fall extending later and spring starting earlier, we're actually seeing that really seems to be what's driving this rapid increase in abundance. They're surviving winter, they're, growing faster because they have a longer growing season, they're breeding faster and more rapidly and more times in a season. So yeah, I would expect to see them continue to increase.
Marissa, you, I guess the organization greencrab.org, this is for people that are local to Mid-Coast Maine, and I know there are a number of people from far afield, but in this area, there was, and in Massachusetts, I think there was a restaurant week. There was a week at which a number of restaurants piloted green crab recipes. That was pre-pandemic. Do you know if that's expected to happen again this spring or this summer?
Yeah, as with most things in the restaurant world and seafood world, the pandemic, of course, really was a setback. A lot of the restaurants that we partnered with are no longer open, which is really sad. But I do know there is a sort of renewed effort to really push this forward. And a lot of that is actually coming directly from the fishing industry. There are people who are really, dedicated to wanting to see this work. So I know that there's going to be restaurants in Portland, and I believe also in more of the like Wells, York area in southern Maine. There's a couple fishers in that area who are going to be producing soft shells. So yeah, I mean, I think this will be the first season since the pandemic that we're going to probably start to see a little bit more momentum build back up again. We had a lot of momentum going for us right up to 2019. And then, it all kind of fizzled out just because, all of the issues that the pandemic caused. So yeah, I'm hopeful that this year we'll start to see green crabs on the menu again.
So is greencrabs.org a good place to look for sort of heads up as to what restaurants might be doing it, or just look at your favorite restaurants' menus?
That is a good one. I think the New Hampshire Sea Grant and Maine Sea Grant websites are also good places to look. And then, outside of that, I think if you have favorite restaurants, and the chef or the owner, it's always good to reach out and just ask, because maybe it's something that's not on their radar and it would be something they'd be interested in. Yeah.
Yep. Great. Got one more question from a major environmentalist in the crowd, because she wants to go out and grab some of these little suckers. Can you tell us how to identify, how are they different from other crabs? What's the telltale?
Yeah, let me, so they have 5 spines. I'm going to try and, I don't know why I can't, oh, here we go. Let's see if there's this one might be a good one to see it on. So they have, no.
That was pretty good.
So these are called spines, and they're on either side. These are the eyes right here. So there's 5 of these spines on either side of the eye on both sides. Sorry. And then in between the eyes, it's harder to see here, but there's 3 spines in between the eyes. So that 5-3-5 pattern of the spines is the easiest way. And also, if you visit our website, manomet.org, we actually have a field guide. So we have a field guide that has photos of native crabs, invasive crabs. This is not the only invasive crab that we have, unfortunately. And there's little clues to identification. And I believe that's available right on our website. If it's not, I can also send it along to Jed and Carolyn after the presentation to distribute.
Great. Well, Marissa, again, thank you. And Carolyn, I don't know if you have any last words, and I'm sure that someplace we have contact information for Marissa. If not, shame on us, and we certainly we can get to her via either Carolyn or me. Carolyn, any closing thoughts?
No closing thoughts, just I will send a link to the recording to everyone who's registered, and I'll find that link to the field guide and include that in the follow-up email tomorrow.
I'm gonna put that link in the chat right now, actually. I just found it.
Oh, great. Perfect.
Great.
Thank you so much, Marissa. And I hope everyone goes out to their favorite restaurant and asks the chef why there's no green crab on the menu.
Please do. Well, thank you so much for having me. This was wonderful. This was all the questions. It was a great discussion.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Bye.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Good night.